Picture a village in the mountains of Zimbabwe. Bantu-speaking families, southern African landscape. People who look, dress, and speak like their neighbors in every visible way. Now watch what happens at mealtime. No pork, no shellfish, no mixing of meat and milk. Animals slaughtered with a single cut of a specific knife. Blood drained completely before the meat is touched. Watch what happens when the week ends. On Saturday, not Sunday, not any other day, work stops. A weekly rest, observed as sacred, with no parallel in any surrounding African tradition. Watch what happens when a son is born. Circumcision, not as a puberty rite like surrounding African peoples, on the 8th day. Specifically the 8th day. Look at the gravestones, Stars of David. The 8th day circumcision was a detail that reorganized everything else for me. In isolation, each of the other practices could theoretically have a regional or independent explanation. But 8th day infant circumcision, not at puberty, not at another age, specifically the 8th day specified in Genesis, has one source in the historical record. It maps onto Jewish law so precisely that encountering it listed as a Lemba tradition in the mountains of Zimbabwe produces a specific kind of cognitive arrest. Look at the clan structure. The most senior clan, the Buba, describes itself in oral tradition as the priestly clan, the holders of sacred knowledge, the descendants of the original founding men. And listen to what the elders say when you ask where their people came from. We came from Sena. Our fathers were Jewish men who crossed the sea. They built a great city. We carry their obligations. For most of the 20th century, Western scholars heard all of this and filed it under romantic mythology. Interesting. Culturally significant. Historically unverifiable. Then in 1999, the geneticists arrived. The Cohen Modal Haplotype, a specific Y chromosome signature found at high frequencies in Jewish Kohanim, the priestly class whose traditions traced patrilineal descent from Aaron, the brother of Moses, appeared in the Lemba. In the Buba clan, the priestly clan, the men whose oral tradition specifically claimed priestly lineage, at approximately 53%. Ashkenazi Kohanim, approximately 45 to 50%. Sephardic Kohanim, approximately 56%. Buba clan, Lemba, approximately 53%. An African oral tradition maintained without writing in the mountains of Zimbabwe across an unknown number of generations was confirmed by the most precise patrilineal genetic test available. The tradition said we descend from priests. The Y chromosome said you carry the genetic signature of priests. The oral tradition was not mythology. It was history, encoded in DNA, preserved across 2,500 years and an entire continent. This video is about three things simultaneously: the Lemba people and how they maintained an ancient identity across millennia in one of the world's most isolated locations, the scientific finding that confirmed their oral tradition in the most dramatic possible way, and what both of these things reveal about oral tradition as a form of historical evidence, and about one of the most famous missing objects in all of human religious history. The Lemba number approximately 80,000 people today, concentrated in the Limpopo province of South Africa and in the Mbarengwa and Masvingo districts of Zimbabwe. They speak Venda and Shona, the same languages spoken by their non-Lemba neighbors. From the outside, nothing immediately marks them as different, but the differences accumulate quickly once you start looking. The dietary restrictions map with striking precision onto Jewish kashrut: no pork, no animals without cloven hooves, no shellfish or bottom-feeding fish, no mixing of meat and dairy in the same meal. These restrictions have no basis in any surrounding African religious tradition. The Lemba maintain them not as recently adopted rules but as ancient obligations inherited from founding ancestors. Obligations they cannot explain theologically, but cannot abandon without violating their identity. The ritual slaughter method corresponds precisely to Jewish shechita, a single cut across the throat with a sharp, smooth-bladed knife, complete drainage of blood before consumption, specific prayers accompanying the act. They maintain the baraket, a specific Lemba knife used exclusively for ritual slaughter, kept separate from other implements, passed down through families. A dedicated ritual implement maintained across generations for a specific religious purpose speaks to the depth of the practice's integration into Lemba daily life. The Endogamy, the prohibition on marriage outside the Lemba community, is the single element of the Lemba story that is easiest to overlook and most important to understand. The surrounding African peoples have no equivalent practice. But the Lemba endogamy achieved something that no external institutional force could have produced: the preservation of a specific Y chromosome haplogroup at majority frequencies in a priestly subclan across 2,500 years in geographic isolation. Without it, the Cohen Modal Haplotype would have been diluted to statistical noise within a few generations of admixture with surrounding populations. The endogamy is what made the genetic confirmation possible. The oral tradition told them to maintain it. The consequence was the survival of the very evidence that would later confirm the tradition's historical accuracy. The Lemba are organized into 12 clans, a number with obvious resonance with the 12 tribes of Israel. The Buba clan holds the highest religious status, performs ritual slaughter for the community, and holds the oral histories about the founding ancestors. 12 clans, priestly lineage, founding fathers who were Jewish men from a city across the sea. Before the genetics can be fully appreciated, the science behind the Cohen Modal Haplotype needs a brief explanation, because without it, the Buba finding cannot be evaluated for what it actually is. In 1997, geneticists Karl Skorecki and David Goldstein asked whether the Kohanim priestly tradition had a genuine biological basis, whether patrilineal descent from Aaron had left any detectable genetic trace. The result was striking. Ashkenazi Kohanim and Sephardic Kohanim, communities geographically separated for over 1,000 years, shared a specific cluster of Y chromosome markers at frequencies far higher than in the broader Jewish population. This shared signature became known as the Cohen Modal Haplotype. It belongs within Y chromosome haplogroup J1, associated with Middle Eastern populations and found at very low frequencies in Bantu African populations. Its presence in sub-Saharan Africa immediately signals a genetic connection to Middle Eastern founding males. I was looking at a comparative frequency table when the three numbers sat next to each other for the first time: 45 to 50, 56, 53. Three independently derived measurements landing within the same range. Ashkenazi communities who had been separated from Sephardic communities for 1,000 years, and a Bantu-speaking clan in Zimbabwe whose oral tradition said they descended from priests. The number from Zimbabwe sitting between the two Jewish numbers as though it had always been part of the dataset. Here's the question. This finding opens that I have not seen seriously addressed in any popular account. If the Lemba oral tradition preserved accurate genetic information across 2,500 years without any written record, without any contact with Jewish communities, what other African oral traditions are we dismissing as mythology that a genetic study would confirm? Share your thoughts in the comments. I am genuinely collecting examples, and the list of confirmed cases is almost certainly longer than the academic literature currently acknowledges. Tudor Parfit was a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies who had spent years investigating the Lemba claim as a scholar who found the evidence compelling enough to warrant serious investigation. His work was unusual in the field. Most scholars had dismissed the Lemba tradition without rigorous examination. Parfit documented their oral histories, learned their practices, traveled repeatedly to Zimbabwe and South Africa, and eventually collaborated with molecular geneticists to test what the DNA could reveal. The 1999 study, conducted with geneticists Mark Thomas, Michael Hammer, and colleagues and published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, collected Y chromosome samples from Lemba men across multiple clans and compared them against databases including Jewish Kohanim, Yemeni Arabs, Bantu populations from surrounding regions, and broader African and Middle Eastern reference populations. The Lemba as a whole showed Y chromosome profiles significantly different from surrounding Bantu-speaking populations. Approximately 50% of Lemba Y chromosomes belong to Semitic-associated haplogroups, found at high frequencies in Jewish and Arab populations, and at very low frequencies in Bantu African populations. The founding male ancestors of the Lemba had come from the Middle East. The Y chromosome data confirmed the directional claim of the oral tradition. The breakthrough came when the researchers shifted to a clan-by-clan analysis. The researchers tested the general Lemba population first, then broke the data down by clan. The Buba finding was not the starting hypothesis. It was an emergent result from a more granular analysis. When the Buba numbers came back at 53%, the finding was not the confirmation of a prediction. It was a result that arrived from within the data itself, which is the kind of finding that is hardest to dismiss. The study confirmed Y chromosome evidence of Jewish priestly ancestry in the Lemba male line. It could not confirm the maternal line, the precise date of the founding event, or a more specific geographic origin than Middle Eastern. These limitations matter for intellectual honesty, but they don't diminish what the core finding established. The specific Y chromosome signature of the Jewish priestly class appears in the specifically priestly clan of an African people who had maintained Jewish practices without contact with Jewish communities for an unknown number of generations. The study confirmed Middle Eastern male ancestry but left open where, in the Middle East. Parfit spent years investigating the specific claim embedded in the oral tradition, Sena. Multiple places carry the name, a Sena in Ethiopia, one on the Zambezi in Mozambique, but the most compelling candidate is Sana'a, the ancient capital of Yemen, whose historical name in Semitic languages was Sena or Sena'a. The Yemen case is supported from three directions independently. The Hadramaut region and the broader Arabian Peninsula have long documented ancient Jewish settlement stretching deep into antiquity. Yemeni Jewish communities maintain dietary laws, circumcision, and Sabbath observance in a geographic context of minimal outside Jewish contact, a situation directly analogous to the Lemba's own isolation. Jewish traders and migrants from the Arabian Peninsula had been active in Indian Ocean trade networks since antiquity. The East African coast, accessible by sail from Yemen, had documented Jewish presence in ancient trading communities. A group of Jewish men who crossed the Indian Ocean and followed trade networks inland toward southern Africa over the course of generations could have reached Zimbabwe. When the Lemba Y chromosome profiles were examined in more detail, the specific subtype of the Cohen Modal Haplotype found in the Lemba rather than the Levantine heartland, three independent evidence streams, linguistic tradition, Y chromosome genetics, and historical documentation of ancient Jewish communities in Yemen, converged on the same geographic location. Each line of evidence arrived at Yemen independently. That kind of convergence is not how coincidence behaves. It is how genuine historical signal behaves when you have enough independent instruments to detect it. The Sena investigation explains the origin, but the most extraordinary element of the Lemba story is not a place. It is an object. Beyond their genetic and dietary practices, the Lemba maintained a tradition about a sacred object. They called it the Ngoma Lungundu, the drum that thunders. The oral tradition described it as a container of immense sacred power, carried by their ancestors from the north, capable of destroying enemies who came near it, requiring specific priestly handling by Buba clan members, forbidden to touch the ground and required to be carried on poles. The biblical description of the Ark of the Covenant from Exodus and Numbers describes a sacred container housing the tablets of the Ten Commandments, carried by Levitical priests. It killed Uzzah when he touched it without authorization, carried on poles, not allowed to touch the ground. The parallel between the Ngoma Lungundu and the Ark is not a vague resemblance. It is a point-by-point correspondence between two traditions describing what may be the same object, or two objects derived from the same original religious tradition. I want to be precise about what I mean by point, because this is the moment in the research where I had to put the material down and account for what I was looking at. Sacred container, priestly handling, specifically by the founding priestly clan, lethal to unauthorized touch, carried on poles, must not touch the ground. Every element maps, not as a general resemblance between ancient sacred objects, as a specific technical description of the same object transmitted through two entirely separate traditions across 2,000 years and an entire continent. Either these are the same object, or they derive from the same original. There is no comfortable third option. The Ark disappeared from the historical record after the Babylonian destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE. It is not mentioned in the accounts of what was taken to Babylon. It simply vanishes. In 2017, Parfit published research claiming to have identified the physical remains of the Ngoma Lungundu, a carved wooden drum discovered in storage in the Harare Museum in Zimbabwe. Carbon dating placed the object's manufacture at approximately 700 years ago. 700 years old, in the storage room of a museum in Harare. Not quite the dramatic archaeological revelation that the story had been building toward, but that is the thing about genuine historical investigation. It rarely ends with the object exactly where you expected it. Parfit argued the drum was a replacement reconstruction of an earlier object that had been destroyed or worn out, following the tradition of maintaining the Ngoma Lungundu's form across generations. The argument is contested. The 700-year date rules out the physical object being the original biblical ark. The parallel between the two traditions is striking, but could reflect shared ancient religious tradition rather than identical objects. But the existence of the Ngoma Lungundu tradition, maintained alongside the dietary laws, the circumcision, the Sabbath rest, and the Cohen Modal Haplotype, adds a layer that cannot simply be dismissed. A people with genetic evidence of Jewish priestly ancestry also maintains a tradition about a sacred priestly object whose description maps onto the most famous lost object in Jewish religious history. The coincidences are accumulating beyond what coincidence can comfortably explain. Western scholarship spent most of the 19th and 20th centuries treating African oral traditions as culturally significant but historically unreliable. The assumption, embedded in academic practice even when not explicitly stated, was that oral traditions distort over time, that without writing history cannot be accurately preserved, that the absence of documentation equals the absence of historical fact. Applied to the Lemba with particular force, the claim seemed geographically implausible and historically unverifiable. It was categorized as mythology. The finding requires a specific revision in oral tradition scholarship that I want to name directly. The methodological assumption that oral traditions cannot preserve accurate information about genetic founding populations across 2,500 years, the assumption that led to the Lemba claim being categorized as mythology without empirical testing, needs to be retired as a default, not weakened, retired. The Lemba case is not evidence that oral traditions are unreliable. It is evidence that the default skepticism was applied without testing it. The test, when it was finally run, produced the opposite result. The oral tradition commanded endogamy. The endogamy preserved the genetics. The genetics confirmed the oral tradition. The three elements reinforced each other in a self-sustaining preservation system that 2,500 years of geographic isolation and cultural pressure could not disrupt. The genetic confirmation created a question the finding itself cannot answer, and that question now sits in the hands of Jewish religious authorities. Under traditional Jewish law, Jewish identity is determined primarily through matrilineal descent. Cohen status is specifically determined through patrilineal descent. The Buba clan's Y chromosomes provide genetic evidence of patrilineal descent from Jewish Kohanim, the most direct possible genetic evidence of the lineage that defines a Kohen. But the African women who carried children across 2,500 years were not Jewish under matrilineal Jewish law. The children of those unions were not Jewish in the halakhic sense, regardless of their father's Y chromosomes. What the gap between the genetic evidence and the halachic framework reveals is that Jewish law and genetic inheritance are measuring two different things, and that when they diverge, there is no obvious mechanism for deciding which measurement is more authoritative. The Cohen Modal Haplotype is the most direct genetic evidence of priestly lineage that exists. The halachic framework requires maternal Jewish identity that the Y chromosome cannot establish. These are not resolvable by the same tool that confirmed the finding. Some Lemba have formalized their connection to Judaism, pursuing conversion or recognition through various Jewish religious authorities. Others maintain that their identity as Lemba, as the people who have preserved their father's obligations for 2,500 years in the mountains of southern Africa, is complete in itself and requires no external validation. Their tradition was confirmed. Their DNA was confirmed. What any external authority says about their status is a secondary question. There is a man walking around in Zimbabwe today, a Buba clan member, speaking Shona or Venda, living a contemporary Southern African life, who carries in his Y chromosome the Cohen Modal Haplotype. He did not choose to carry it. He did not know it was there until someone ran a genetic test. He is the unbroken end of a patrilineal chain that runs from him backward. Through his father, through his father's father, through 20 generations of Lemba men who rested on Saturday and refused pork and slaughtered with the baraket, all the way back to a man somewhere in the ancient Middle East, in a community called Sena, who was a priest. That chain was never documented. It was never written. It survived through the most unremarkable possible mechanism, fathers having sons. And when the test was run in 1999, the chain was still intact. The oral tradition was right. The priests of the Lemba are still carrying the genetic signature of priests. 2,500 years later, in Zimbabwe, history doesn't always get written down. Sometimes it just gets passed from father to son, in a Y chromosome, in a command to rest on Saturday, in a knife kept separate for ritual slaughter. Sometimes the oral tradition knows things that the written record forgot to mention. The Lemba always knew. The DNA confirmed it. If you made it to the end of this one, you're exactly who I make these videos for. Someone who finds it genuinely strange and extraordinary that a Y chromosome can preserve a 2,500-year-old priestly lineage in the mountains of Zimbabwe, and who wants to know what else the standard history missed. Subscribe. That question has a lot of answers, and I intend to go through all of them. Thanks for watching.